I'm Rob Trasinski. This is Symposium, where we talk about the ideas at the foundation of a free society. My guest today is Jeremiah Johnson, who is Policy Director at the Center for New Liberalism and host of the Neoliberal podcast. Thanks for coming on.
Really glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
So what prompted me to bring you on here is you just wrote something. It's a pitch to disaffected libertarians, asking to join you as part of the neoliberal movement. And that's something that I've been sort of exploring a lot with Symposium as well. So before we get to what that pitch is, what I'd like to ask you is, we have this weird political terminology in America that doesn't always make very much sense. So what is a neoliberal, and what is the liberal part, and what is the neo part?
Yeah, so that's a great question. It is a term, neoliberal, that has gone through many generations of understanding. It might mean something different to one generation as opposed to another one. It's often been used as a slur, kind of a political attack word. And in the past, nobody would willingly self-identify as a neoliberal. It was something that, like, someone on the left would say to insult someone that they thought was too market-oriented. But there's a modern neoliberal movement to reclaim the word, much in the way that socialist is being actively reclaimed by today's left. And, there's democratic socialists, and they have members of Congress. And, it's a word that has kind of been at least partially successfully reclaimed, socialist. And we are essentially doing the same thing for neoliberal. We believe in a lot of different things. If I had to summarize it very quickly to give you like the 2-minute version, we are capitalists who still like the welfare state. We don't think that those two things are in conflict, although, in modern politics, you often see them in conflict so much. If somebody proudly proclaims that they are not a socialist, they are a capitalist, it always comes with the side of, well, we have to tear down all regulations of the welfare state. And we don't think that's necessary. We think it's possible to be proud capitalists and also in favor of a social spending safety net that helps people. We're proud globalists in terms of being very much in favor of free trade, immigration, international cooperation and institutions. And we are philosophical liberals at the core. We believe in the core values that liberalism as a political philosophy has always believed in. Things like the value of markets, the value of the classical liberal freedoms, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, et cetera. The value of liberal ideas like equality before the law, the rule of law and not the rule of a single person, an autocrat, the value of liberal democracy and democratic representation, all those kind of core foundational liberal beliefs that go back to thinkers in the 17 and 1800s. That's what we base ourselves on as well. So happy to get more into it, but that's the short version of what a neoliberal believes.
Right. So sort of back to Locke and Mill. And this is the thing I've been saying a lot about, the need for a philosophical liberalism because I see people using the term like, Bernie Sanders is an extreme liberal. And in a lot of senses, he isn't. I mean, he's a socialist. It's a different thing. And so the meaning of the word liberal,
that just speaks to the point that the words we use change over time. Liberal, socialism, all these things have different meanings depending on which generation you are, depending on where you are. Liberal in America is very different from a liberal in Europe sometimes.
Well, yeah, I mean, the liberalism in Europe is the one place where liberalism sort of kept its meaning as being oftentimes the more center-right or pro-free market party, and also in Australia, rather than it being associated with the left. So let's talk about the context here, though, of what's going on recently in libertarianism, that there has been, you're seeing this opportunity because there's been this turmoil in the libertarian movement, in the Libertarian Party, their recent convention. So let's talk a little bit about that context and why you think that creates a reason for libertarians to be disaffected with that movement.
Sure. So I'll cite a few things that are useful. If you want to learn more about this, there's a couple sources that I would recommend, both libertarian sources and non-libertarian sources. I would cite Reason, who wrote a really good article about this and what's happening as a libertarian source talking about their own movement. Also, the Southern Poverty Law Center, which is typically very critical of right-leaning institutions and libertarians, wrote an excellent piece on this. But the core of the story is that a group calling themselves the Mises Caucus has taken over the Libertarian Party, the institutions and kind of the body and all of the governing functions of the Libertarian Party. The Mises Caucus is named after Ludwig von Mises, who was an Austrian economist way back in the day,
and who is probably turning over in his grave, by the way. But
probably, yeah. We'll get to that. But this caucus, to put it very bluntly, is essentially an alt-right and white nationalist, or at least pseudo-white nationalist group of people. The leaders of it certainly are. I don't know whether every single person affiliated with them realizes the extent to which that's what they're following. But just to give a couple examples, the Mises Caucus has a website where they have articles that offer these weird, soft-pedaled defenses of Hitler. Actually, Hitler wasn't such a bad guy. He was just trying to be a great German, like Otto von Bismarck. Like, that's... it makes you question, like, what kind of person goes out of their way to like make that point? It's not something a normal person does. Like, why don't I write a soft-pedaled defense of Hitler? The person that they want to nominate for president is a comedian named Dave Smith. It's the preferred Mises Caucus candidate, and Dave Smith pals around with a who's who of the alt-right white supremacist crowd: Gavin McInnes, Richard Spencer, Chris Cantwell, Michelle Malkin, just all of the typical names where...
Right. And these are not, one of the things we have to overcome here is there's sort of a history of people being sort of guilt by association, or somebody with heterodox views being smeared as a racist. That Richard Spencer, Chris Cantwell, and these days, Michelle Malkin, these people are not, their views are not hidden. These people are out and out self-declared racists. So this is, something that is not even a controversial point as to who they are.
Yeah, I mean, and look, there's a certain level on which guilt by association works. Yeah. just to be very blunt, like Dave Smith, the guy in question, went and did a guest host of Gavin McInnes's podcast. Gavin McInnes is the founder of the Proud Boys, I believe, which is a repugnant organization that advocates violence and racism. And so maybe he's just trying to teach them something good. Maybe he's just asking questions, ideas. Okay, so he goes on the Proud Boys podcast as the guest host, and who does he invite on? Richard Spencer. That's a normal thing to do if you're not a racist. Maybe he just wanted to debate him. You can go through these like levels of denial, but when you spend half an hour with Richard Spencer on a podcast with both of you talking about how anti-white racism is the real problem in America today, and it ends with you saying, well, I don't agree with everything you say, but actually you're much more reasonable than your critics. And who does that? No normal person does that in a conversation with Richard Spencer, who is arguably the most famous white supremacist in America. Like, on a certain level, yes. And then if you really want the receipts, like, we have video of Dave Smith saying that like Black people are genetically less intelligent than white people, and that's a scientific fact. And he calls transgender people horrible slurs that I'm not going to repeat. He calls them they're liars. Their whole identity is a lie, and just there's all this stuff. But all of this only to say that the Mises Caucus, this is the group of people who they are. Their number one platform at the Libertarian National Convention when they staged this takeover was, we need to remove an instance where the Libertarian Party stands against bigotry. There was some sort of generic line: the Libertarian Party condemns bigotry as irrational and repugnant. And they said, we need to get rid of that. And they did. And this caucus, because of the way the Libertarian Party is structured, it doesn't take a lot to like take over state parties. These state parties are not large organizations. It's the Libertarian Party.
Right.
You show up with 20 people at your state Libertarian convention and you will run the convention because you have the most people there. And so this kind of alt-right podcast bro network started like organizing their listeners to go to these events. They took over a bunch of state libertarian parties, and now they've taken over the national party. You know, that it simple as that.
Yeah, it reminds me a little bit of how NIMBYism works, which is that nobody shows up for zoning hearings except for this small cadre of people who don't want you to build anything. And small movements are like that. That if you have a Libertarian Party convention, especially a state level convention, it's a small group. You get a committed group of fanatics, you can sort of take it over. I find it interesting, though, that this particular group of fanatics has white nationalists is a group that also traditionally was, there's a very small number of them. It's hard to get many of them together in one place. And so that's sort of the worrying thing, that they are rising in number enough that they could actually do this. So that's the context for this. This is something is not 100% a surprise to me. I come from the more libertarian end of things. I don't call myself a libertarian for various reasons, mostly because they're the sort of people who are so fanatically anti-war that they'll say Hitler wasn't such a bad guy, so he shouldn't have fought World War II. And that's the other part that doesn't surprise me about it. But also there's this whole history going back in libertarianism of saying, well, libertarianism is this philosophy that could appeal to anyone. I remember a guy from 30, 40 years ago saying, well, we could convince neo-Nazis to be libertarians by telling them that, we'll leave you alone to have your views and your ideas, and to try to convince, that libertarianism was so philosophically ecumenical, you could bring anybody on board. And I think that's part of the reason for what happened, is they were so philosophically ecumenical that the barriers were not there to keep people like this out. And this has been sort of creeping up for a while. Like the New Hampshire Libertarian Party Twitter feed has been alt-right for a couple of years now. There's
a recurring segment that we do on Twitter where it's like the state libertarians are at it again, because some of the most insane things you will ever find come out of like state libertarian social media, the Texas Libertarian Party or the New Hampshire Libertarian Party. But there's a couple theories about why this in particular is happening. Why is there not like an alt-right takeover of the Green Party? Or why is there not like a white nationalist to the Communist Party of America, a kind of pipeline? Why is it alt-right and libertarians? It's important to recognize that there's history here. This has been an association that's existed for a long time. Murray Rothbard certainly flirted with white nationalism. If he was not a outright white nationalist, he was very curious and flirted with it a lot. Triple H, Hans Hermann Hoppe, he was an outright white supremacist. And so some of the most important libertarian thinkers and kind of personalities come from this world. You've got history like Ron Paul, who is probably the most important libertarian in history politically. Ron Paul's newsletters for years trafficked in extremely racist propaganda and tropes and homophobic stuff. And, Ron Paul eventually, years later, like a decade later, tried to disavow some of it, said that it wasn't him who wrote it, but that's in question.
Well, and even if it wasn't him who wrote it, it's his newsletter. So he hired the person who wrote it. And I know who probably wrote it, which is Lou Rockwell.
Yeah, Lou Rockwell.
And that's part of the history here, is there was this idea, Llewellyn Rockwell it sort of came from Murray Rothbard, but mostly by way of one of Rothbard's followers, which was Llewellyn Rockwell, who had this idea of the Paleo-Conservative Libertarian Alliance. And that sort of waned and wasn't really pursued for a long time. I think it's interesting. It's sort of come roaring back, much more successful than it ever was when Rockwell originally was pursuing this back in the 80s.
Yeah. And there are theories about why this happens. Like one theory is just that, look, people who like weird, countercultural ideologies will also like other weird countercultural ideologies, because both libertarianism and white nationalism are fringe in American politics. They are not mainstream. You have to kind of seek them out. It's a kind of group of misfits. And I think that has some explanatory power, but not a ton, because again, there's no Green Party to white nationalist pipeline that I'm aware of in the way that there is clearly a libertarian to alt-right white nationalism. One of the best explanations for this that I've seen comes from Sam Hammond at the Niskanen Center. who are kind of like libertarian light, libertarian, you might call it, neoliberal even.
They're libertarians who are coming in from the cold and becoming more accepting of the welfare state. Yeah.
Yes. They're very pro-welfare state over there. The Sam Hammond has a bunch of work on this.
Yeah.
But Hammond's theory is essentially that if you hate the state for one reason, it'll be really easy to convince you to hate the state for another reason. And not just hate, but view the state as fundamentally illegitimate, because a lot of libertarianism rests not the moderate kind, not kind of your inside the beltway, respectable Washington, D.C. Cato guy kind of libertarianism, but the kind of folk libertarianism that exists out in the prairies. It's a real thing. It's a real sense that the state is illegitimate at its core. You know, if you believe in the non-aggression principle, no state action is viable. Coercion is immoral, and the state is just fundamentally illegitimate in almost all cases. And the thing is, white nationalists agree with that. They view the modern state as illegitimate, but for them, it's because white people aren't in charge in an explicit racial hierarchy. So I think that explanation honestly makes sense to me, that if you start with the premise that the state is fundamentally illegitimate, it's very easy to convince you of additional reasons why it's illegitimate. So I don't know, there's a weird alliance there. And a lot of the paleo libertarians explicitly acknowledge this. People like, you know, Lou Rockwell would talk about how, you know, we need to ally with these people because they also hate the state. We need to ally with these racists because at least they're not in favor of the welfare state.
And I think it also goes back to the fact that for a long time, libertarians were the only people who would basically stand up for or defend your right to be a racist, right?
There's a great quote. If you create a society where you take a principled stand against witch hunts, we will not witch hunt anyone. You know, and society has a lot of witch hunts going on, and you say, I'm not going to stand for it. No witch hunts. You will end up with about 3 or 4 principled libertarians, and you will end up with about 17,000 witches. Where are all the witches going to go? You know, and that's a problem. It's a problem for people who are free speech advocates, because I deeply believe in free speech, but I recognize this is a social phenomenon when you defend racists, that there's a line you can walk. The ACLU for a long time walked it really well, where they defended the Nazis' right to march without becoming a Nazi organization. But it is an issue.
Yeah, it's a dilemma that comes up a lot. Like a lot of these pro free speech social media sites, like Gab or something like that. You know, they say, oh, we're not gonna kick anybody out for any reason whatsoever, and then of course immediately they become a clubhouse for the neo-Nazis, because they're like, great, somebody, you basically become the place where everybody who gets kicked off of every other site for being obnoxious comes to yours, because they know you're not going to get rid of them. So you get the worst of the worst. I've argued for a long time that if you want to start a new social media company to compete with Facebook or Twitter, you have to have better moderation, not less moderation.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. The only reason you would abandon the scale of Twitter or TikTok or Facebook is because you want a space that's either an echo chamber or where you're not going to get banned.
Yeah, and I think that maybe is a great analogy for what's going on with libertarianism. They became the place where all the dregs from everywhere else could go. And like you said, you know, the state libertarian parties, because they're these small, outside, very, very far outside the mainstream organizations, have this history of sort of producing strange and crazy people. But they used to be sort of like, you know, more of some source of amusement. Like there was some guy who was a libertarian candidate in Montana who had been taking silver supplements and turned his skin blue. And, you know, so they were usually sort of like these sort of harmless crackpots. And that what's disturbing now is to see that somebody realized that a place that is an open field for the harmless crackpots can also become a place where all the harmful crackpots can go.
Yeah, and look, I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about how the Libertarian Party is awful now, and the libertarian movement has been poisoned, and blah blah blah, and people might get this sense that I'm just ideologically against libertarianism, which I want to state is not true. the first political party I ever joined was the Libertarian Party. When I was 16 years old, I sent them $25 in the mail so they would register me as a libertarian. I was one of your typical, a teenage boy libertarians who just discovers political philosophy and thinks it's the greatest thing in the world. And I changed as I got older, as I read more and more. I would no longer consider myself a libertarian, but I do have libertarian instincts in a lot of ways. And there's a lot of issues where I would align very strongly with libertarians. And I feel like that set of libertarian instincts is valuable. I talk all the time about how like the Democratic Party, which is where I work today, needs to be more libertarian. And I think there are a lot of libertarians or libertarian leaners who are aghast at what's happened to the Libertarian Party. I think that probably even most libertarians are more principled than this. They don't want to be a home for racism and bigotry. And so it's important to note that, even as I'm going to spend the rest of the podcast just viciously dunking on libertarians, that there's a lot of principled libertarians out there who do not want to be part of this.
Well, actually, I want to steer us away from talking about the libertarians, but I want you to give your positive pitch here. And that seems to be where we're headed to. What's your positive pitch for neoliberalism as a place that would be attractive, not just for people who are sort of your sort of 20th century pro-welfare state, quote unquote, liberals, but also for people who consider ourselves, or people who are libertarians, or people like me who consider ourselves classical liberals? What's the pitch for neoliberalism as maybe as an alliance or as a new home? Make your pitch for that.
Sure. So the first thing I'll note is that in modern American politics, I'll use the U.S. as a lens here, because international will be a little bit different. But in modern American politics, you have to work within one of the two parties. Third party movements don't work. We have a long history of showing this. So you have to become a caucus or a movement within a major party, or attempt to influence the major parties in some way. Libertarianism arguably has had its most successful moments as part of the Republican fusionist movement. So the actual Libertarian Party is and always has been a dead-end movement. The ideas of libertarianism can succeed if they are part of a larger ideological structure within the two-party system. And that's one of the things we're doing at the Neoliberal Project, is working within that system, because we think it's clearly the best way to get results. The second thing is ideas-based. For people who consider themselves classical liberals or libertarians, there are going to be a huge amount of areas where you are in strong agreement with neoliberals. Neoliberals are proud capitalists. We think that market economics and the development of markets as a social force has led to incredible flourishing over the past few hundred years of human history. Human wealth is not something that is the default. The default for most of history was that everybody was poor and dirty and lived a short life and died in miserable pain. And this kind of modern flourishing is very new, and it's due to the power of markets. Now, we don't think markets are perfect, but we strongly believe that they are a tool for human advancement. We believe in, immigration and the value that relatively free immigration has. We believe in free trade very strongly. We believe in deregulating a lot of areas like employment and housing. Occupational licensing is extremely burdensome to a lot of people. 25% of the country has to have a license to work at this point, and the requirements are incredibly high, and they should be lowered. There's far too many regulations that govern our housing markets, whether it be zoning codes, floor area ratios, parking requirements, setback requirements, 2, 3, 4 years of environmental impact statements. All of these things have led to the national housing crisis we have. I could kind of keep listing.
One thing that part of my full awakening on this was realizing that every little town I'm in Virginia, Central Virginia. It's not I didn't think a highly regulated area, but I discovered every little town has a literal 5-year plan for what kind of development they're going to. They actually call it a 5-year plan, and I'm like, there's a history there. Yeah. But they have this, basically for what development they're going to allow to have happen, and this absolutely keeps the price of housing high, which is a major impact on people's well-being.
Yep. So we are massively in favor of deregulating the housing market because it's simply too restrictive. We are social liberals who are very strongly against any form of bigotry. We believe the classical liberal freedoms apply to everyone, regardless of your sex, your gender, your age, your race, your religion, all of that. There's no equivocation there. And so I think it's important to note that there's going to be a lot of areas where we agree. There will be a few areas where potentially a ideological libertarian would disagree with us. But my argument there is that if you want to follow the evidence of what actually leads to a more free world, a world with more liberty and freedom are kind of buzzwords here. I would argue that a world with strong capitalist market economies and a robust welfare state leads to the most free world. Now, if your conception of liberty is that it's the non-aggression principle, any coercive action is against the non-aggression principle, and I just won't stand for it, well, you know, I kind of can't talk you out of that if you're just committed to that. But if you're the kind of libertarian who sometimes thinks that the state could be okay, but it's, you know, I'm suspicious of it naturally, I'd make a case for just conceptualizing freedom in a different way. I like to read Amartya Sen, who's a Nobel Prize winning economist. He wrote a book called Development as Freedom, where he talks about, you know, what is freedom? Freedom to him is the ability to lead your life in a way that is you determine, in a way that is meaningful to you. And his point is that there's a lot of things that can stop you from doing that. Certainly the government can be one of those forces that stops you from living your life the way you would prefer to live it. But there's other things. Religion can do that. Cultural norms can do that. Poverty can do that. The classic example is, you know, in a perfect libertarian society, somebody living under a bridge, homeless with nothing to eat, is not meaningfully free in any way, even if the government is not restricting them. There's a meaningful sense in which they are unfree by virtue of their circumstances in general poverty. And I would argue that the welfare state, by contributing to economic opportunity, by taking all that wealth that the market produces and helping just redistribute it a little bit so that everyone can participate in that success, that leads to a more free society with more people actually able to pursue the lives that are meaningful to them. So I realize that to some classical liberals or libertarians, this is a little bit of unorthodoxy, and that they're going to react against that. But that's what I would say, is that the welfare state, in some forms of thinking about how freedom works, is actually freedom increasing rather than freedom decreasing.
Right, so it's in a way, it's more Mill than Locke. But so that brings me to the question, though, of how we create this sort of coalition, because I know exactly why we don't like that kind of argument, the hungry man is not free argument, because what it ends up meaning is when you say, oh, well, then people should have certain things provided to them by government, that never ends up being a moderate or limited welfare state. It's always, and we've seen this again and again, it's always, well, we need to have one more thing and one more thing and one more thing. And you end up with, you know, basically a lot of the modern history of the Democratic Party is them saying, okay, we passed this healthcare bill, but now we're going to start complaining about the healthcare system so we can pass another healthcare bill that will have more government control over healthcare. Or we've done healthcare, now we're going to do student loans. And we've done student loans, now we're going to keep looking for the next thing that is an important thing you need in life, and therefore the government is going to be providing it for you. And there seems to be, you know, how do you create a limiting principle that would create something that provides more assurance to those of us who don't want to just sort of see center-left liberalism as sort of a compromise or stepping stone to, you know, Bernie Sanders?
That's a great question. You know, I'm willing in principle to say, okay, maybe some degree of welfare state is good, but I don't trust you guys. You guys are going to keep asking for more and more and more. How can I trust you? You've set me up really nicely there, because I have an article that I actually wrote maybe a year ago, maybe 2 years ago, called Against Maximalism, which is the name that I've given to the trend you describe. I I view there's a movement in the Democratic Party that I see that I call maximalism, that is essentially what you're talking about, that all welfare spending is good, all taxes are good, all regulation is good. The only way that a welfare program could be bad is if it could have been bigger. And I call this maximalism. And you see this from Bernie Sanders, certainly. You see it from Elizabeth Warren at this point. There was a funny moment in the 2020 Democratic primaries where Elizabeth Warren came out with a 6% wealth tax, which would have been, it's an absurd policy. It's higher than anywhere else in the world by a lot. The implications of it are staggering. And after she did it, about 3 days later, Bernie Sanders came out with an 8% wealth tax, just to one up her, just to be like, you can't get me, you know. And again, this is an absurd policy. The actual implications are that any company that's big enough, the government will own half of it after like 5 or 6 years. You know, just what happens when you take 8% of some billionaire's company every year. The government's going to own the whole thing after just a decade. But so I feel like I have a pretty good track record of being against that form of maximalism. I wrote the first piece on it that I'm aware of called Against Maximalism. And I think that the neoliberal project and institutionally our neoliberal movement is the force that you want to align with if your goal is to have a reasonable welfare state, a state that in amount can be moderated, and not just in amount, but in type. To me, I don't worry so much about the sheer volume of dollars that get sent to people, because I don't think America, you know, when you look at like international comparisons, we are not wildly radical in like the amount of money that we redistribute compared to other rich countries. What I do worry about is the complexity of that state and how we have this enormous mess of regulations governing who can and can't work and receive which and which benefit. And we've got 10 different healthcare systems because we've got the VA and we've got Medicare and we've got Medicaid and we've got the Obamacare markets and then we've got the other unregulated stuff. And we've got, you know, these temporary assistance for needy families is a nightmare. The food stamps, we've got this ridiculous quilt patchwork of programs that the complexity really drives people away. And what you end up doing is spending money on programming rather than actually getting the money to people. So a lot of what I worry about is how do we have a simplified system that just, you know, we get people money when they need it and that's it.
Yeah, I also think there's an aspect too that we have a welfare state that's built up as a middle class welfare state, where it's mostly people being taxed to provide benefits that come back to themselves, and we have the wealthiest middle class in the entire history of human life. Yeah. Being welfare recipients, which strikes me as kind of crazy. But
especially if you view tax incentives as welfare, which basically they are. If you think about like the mortgage interest deduction on middle class homes, is that the same thing as welfare to middle class people? Functionally, yeah. You know, I consider it to be roughly equivalent.
We've partly gotten rid of that though by making the standard exemption higher. So I so that most people don't actually end up claiming that. But the test that I put out in terms of trying to this maximalism problem, as you put it, the test that I like to put to people who are sort of center left is, okay, what welfare program would you get rid of? Because they can't all possibly work. They, you know, we've done so many different things. They can't all possibly be indispensable. Which one would you reform? Which regulatory program would you get rid of? Because we've done that in the past. We had in the late 70s, early 80s, part of the turn to the right, then you got rid of the Interstate Commerce Commission. There were various regulatory things and various kinds of deregulation that were pushed through, kinds of regulations that were gotten rid of, kinds of welfare state that were pulled back. And so the question is, I'd like to sort of see the biggest, in a way, I don't want to be hostile on this, but the biggest barrier sometimes that I see to a sort of alliance between the classical liberals and the neoliberals is what I call smug liberalism, which is, there's so many people, I think, sort of on the center left who are used to being the mainstream. They're used to being the reasonable position that everybody gravitates towards, that they don't see the need to make changes or concessions to the classical liberal or libertarian side of things.
Sure. So it's a reasonable question. And I ask the same thing, if Bernie Sanders is not just big government all the time, big, 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 if that's an unfair accusation, then find me an instance where he's wanted to reduce government spending. Sure. In any instance. And it's very hard for people to come up with that unless it's like reducing military spending. Right. If you were to ask me like what regulations I want to get rid of, I could name a bunch. NEPA is one of my least favorite pieces of legislation, the National Environmental Protection Act. It's what stops us from being able to build infrastructure that doesn't take 5 years to complete or go $100 billion over budget. The average environmental impact statement from NEPA takes more than 4 years to complete. That's a real statistic. If NEPA requires you for your big thing, and a lot of teams, it's funny, a lot of times these are environmental projects. These are things like, let's build, a rail line so that people don't have to use their cars as much. This is pro-environment. Let's build a giant solar farm. And these will get NEPA reviewed and delayed for years because of environmental rules. So I would basically get rid of NEPA. I would get rid of zoning controls. I would get rid of occupational licensing. I would loosen immigration restrictions. There's a lot of areas where I can name.
Please throw in the Jones Act.
Yes, the Jones Act should die in a fire. And one that's been getting more publicity recently is there's a dredging law, and I forget the exact name of it, but there's a law similar to the Jones Act that any ships that do dredging of like underwater muck or whatever, which is kind of a vital port activity.
Right. So to be able to open up a large harbor to bring big ships in. Yeah.
And anybody who does dredging or just to like get a ship that was stuck out of being stuck, that has to be an American ship. And so that's similar to the Jones Act. That should go away. So I feel like I can credibly name a bunch of stuff that I would actually get rid of. In terms of welfare spending, I would say that the TANF programs they're so poorly designed that at this point they should probably just be eliminated. And if your desire is still to use that money to help people, let's just make another program that's very easy bigger. Let's make food stamps a little bigger. Let's make the child tax credit happen again. But temporary assistance for needy families is typically given out in block grants to states who can then kind of use it for a variety of purposes. And a lot of states use it for really stupid stuff that doesn't actually help people. And so TANF, which is kind of the last gap. When people say welfare, TANF from the 90s is often what they mean. And they don't realize that the actual like welfare of like, you just get a check from the government is now this decrepit little program that barely hits anyone and is mostly used so like Alabama can do like an abstinence only sex education thing. It's just used for the most ridiculous stuff. I would kill TANF and try to just use it to send people checks. One of my favorite welfare programs has just been the child tax credit, which again, is a tax credit? Is it a tax cut? Is it a welfare program? Potato, a little bit, but it's great because it just sends parents a check. If you have a kid, to a first approximation, you just get a check. There's no real bureaucracy involved. There's no limiting factors. There's no regulations on you have to be looking for work. If you're out of work, you have to show off the form that you were looking for work for X hours. It's just kids get a check, and they reduce child poverty by like 40% instantly. So something like that I'm in favor of. TANF is a program where I don't know that it's worth it anymore. So these are conversations we can have, but the neoliberal position is typically just that we don't have an ideological stance. We're not going to be always spending good, or spending bad. You've got to get into the weeds of which programs are actually helping people the most.
Yeah. So I'd like to maybe in the future talk to you about like a Paul Ryan style entitlement reform where you're trying to, I guess have a huge amount of our welfare state, Social Security, Medicare is taxes coming out of the middle class and going back to the prosperous middle class rather than to somebody who's actually poor. But let's talk about where I see the sort of upside of the neoliberal position and this sort of neoliberal alliance is you say neoliberalism works, and you're talking about politically, but I also think that, you know, a free market with a moderate-sized welfare state actually has a track record of not being a bad system. I mean, it's the system we basically lived under for the last 60, 80 years. And it's, you know, I'm sort of at a kick against catastrophism. You know, there's this tendency to say, oh, everything's going downhill, and unless you accept my radical solution to everything, the world is going to end in 12 years. And, you know, there's the versions of that on the left, the versions of that on the right. And in a way, you know, the free market welfare state, Sam Hammond used that phrase, the free market welfare state is not a bad system. It's a system that we've done reasonably well with. So but what I'm more is that I'm more the classical liberal who's looking for not so much to join up onto the full agenda of that, but looking for that as people I can view as political allies. But that brings us back to the two-party political system. And how well is it actually working out to work within the Democratic Party? Because I see a lot of things I recognize in the Democratic Party of there's a faction, the sort of far left, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Bernie Sanders faction, that does have this sort of outsized influence on it in the way that the, you know, religious right and the MAGA people had this outsized influence on the Republican Party. So it's giving me a little deja vu there. So how do you solve that problem of, you know, Democratic Party politics is famously a competition between the sort of the radicals on the left and the moderates? How do you basically, there seems to be almost a chicken and egg here, that to get more of us classical liberals and libertarians on board, you'd be stronger in resisting the maximalists, Bernie Sanders wing. But at the same time, in order to get us on board, you have to already be pushing back against that. And I'm not sure I see a lot of that happening right now.
I mean, I think if you're not seeing it, you might not be looking. You know, there's the Build Back Better bill didn't happen because of pushback from moderate Democratic senators. And even if it had happened, and it might actually happen in some reduced form, it's now more narrowly tailored actually as kind of an inflation fighting bill, and it's not going to increase the deficit. There's kind of ongoing talks right now. We'll see if they work out, but there's active instances where you can see the moderate wing of the party having influence and resisting some of these giant spending bills. So I think it's been pretty obvious that happens. More to the point, though, I think, like, we can debate the effectiveness of working within the two-party system. I think what's not really debatable is that working outside the two-party system is just a lost cause. I talk to people sometimes who are like, oh, well, should I join this third party? You know, Andrew Yang is starting the Forward Party. And I don't want to tell them, like, don't get involved in politics, because people should, if you feel the need to be out there organizing or being an activist, knocking on doors, I should always be encouraged. But the Forward Party is not going to go anywhere. Like, this is not how our system works. And I don't think it's a great system. I wish we had kind of a multi-party parliamentary system like a lot of other countries do, without first past the post voting. I think those systems are superior, but we have the first past the post two-party system that we have. So that's the reality we live in. You have to pick a party and try to influence that party. For us,
the way I think about it is with the multi-party systems you have in Europe, what you always have is a governing coalition of different parties. And what we've done is, our version is, well, each party we have only two major parties, but each party is a coalition. It's a coalition of these different factions.
And for us, what I would argue is that the Republican Party's coalition at the moment is not worth joining. The Republican Party has essentially been taken over by people who don't care about democracy, people who would overthrow elections if they could, and who are organizing right now to get the chance to do that. They are very much trying to take over the local, state, and bodies that control voting boards, that control election commissions. When somebody shows you who they are, you can believe them. They've been taken over by people who are extremely questionable in terms of their relationships with bigots and racists. And I don't know, for me, it's just, I want no part of that. To be a neoliberal, as I am, is to be a liberal first. And so before any individual policy, before I think about like a level of spending, like you have to protect liberal democracy. You have to protect the rule of law. That comes before, institutions come before policy, is the way that I sometimes say this. And the Republican Party is so anti-institution at this point that I won't be part of it. And so that leaves me the option of working within the Democratic Party. And I think there is some rising amount of illiberalism on the left, but I don't think it's fair to say that it's equal to what's going on the right. Both parties have become a little bit more illiberal. They have wings that are more illiberal, but only one has attempted to overthrow an election, has invaded the US Capitol. Only one party has had a president that says the election is fake and I actually won. Like that's just beyond the pale. And I don't know how any right-thinking liberal could ever align with that. So yeah. In a sense, you don't have a lot of great options, but I think that the option that we do have is reasonable, and that working within the Democratic Party to make it a more market-friendly party is a good option, and one that I think works.
Well, I'm very much used to not having a lot of good options. And I think that's a good issue to end on, though, which is that we're about to have January 6th committee hearings going on in Congress over the next couple of weeks. And that really is, I think, a major issue. I say I have a very simple standard. I will vote for the party that wants to allow me to vote again. Or at least to count my vote, instead of overturning it on some state level official saying, no, we think you really voted for Trump, and so we're going to change the results. And I think that is a big enough issue to sort of help create at least a temporary coalition. I'm also more interested in the idea of the reason the third parties don't work is, generally speaking, when a third party is successful, to the extent it's successful, its ideas get canalized by one of the major parties. So I think to some extent the bigger thing is to work on an ideological coalition and having these kind of conversations and going back and forth over the merits of the welfare state, or and talking about the philosophical basis of liberalism, making the case for a free society. So I think there's certainly an ideological commonality here that we should be exploring. And that's why I'm glad you came on to talk to me today.
Yeah, well, and that's one of the founding theses of our movement, is that all politics is identity politics. And that phrase identity politics is often used in an insulting way, like Black people care about Black issues, women care about women issues, blah, blah, blah. But I think, again, all politics is identity politics. You look at what Trump does when he's at a rally in rural America and this sea of white rural people is out there, and listen to him speak to them and tell me that's not identity politics at play. You look at the way that even explicitly ideological stuff, where you're like, this is an ideology, not an identity. But, what is an identity? Somebody who has the red rose in their handle on Twitter is advertising not just socialism is the ideology belief. It's socialism is what I am. I am a socialist, and you see this, right? Libertarians often have the Statue of Liberty on Twitter. Neoliberals have the globe. Everybody's got their little emoji that is a group signal of what you are. It's a signal, I am part of this tribe. And the tribe, every one of these groups has their religious figures, their holy men, their prophets that they believe, their hated out group with their demonized people that they just can't stand. They have their own little catchphrases and inside jokes and their holy books. For libertarians, it might be, something by Milton Friedman. For neoliberals, it might be Why Nations Fail by Ashimolu. For the socialists, maybe it's Marx.
I've got my Ayn Rand books, so.
But so like in every way that matters, these are almost like identity markers. You've got your in group and your out group and your coded language that only you understand. And it's very much an identity. And when you talk about how ideological groups have to rise, we're very much trying to create a neoliberal identity, because that's how you actually leverage power in the end is, you create this group where like people realize, wow, like a huge chunk of the country now identifies as this, and I've got to court them. I've got to take their ideas seriously. or else they're not going to vote for me. But that identity formation comes first. And so it's very self-consciously something that we're trying to do to cultivate that kind of neoliberal identity, where the more people who stand up and say, I am a neoliberal and I vote kind of thing, the more seriously you get taken within the coalition, the more your ideas are actually going to matter.
Right. Well, thanks for coming on to talk to me about this. And I'm not sure I'm convinced by this pitch, but I think it's a really good conversation to have. So thanks for talking to me.
Thanks for having me on.
I'm Rob Trzynski. This is Symposium. You can find us on Substack at symposium.substack.com. Please like this video if you're watching on YouTube, helps us find more readers, or subscribe to the podcast. Thank you for joining the conversation.